Hi, I'm Matthew Premsyler, and I'm your host for the world premiere of student-led U.S. history. On today's very special episode, we're going to be talking about America, before and shortly after Columbus. Before we jump in, there are two main ideas you need to understand before talking about America before Columbus. 1. Different tribes, nations, and peoples existed across the continent, and they had different cultural, social, and political organizations. And 2. These groups shaped, and were in turn shaped by, their environment, which was the cause of this diversity. So here, we're going to go region by region, comparing and contrasting different native groups, and explaining what role the environment played in their diversity. And the divisions we are going to be using are as follows: Northeast, Southeast, Great Plains, Great Basin, Southwest, and Pacific Coast. We're also going to talk about groups north and south of U.S. borders. So, let's start in the Northeast. The main group here is the Algonquins. The Algonquins are an ethnic group encompassing a bunch of different tribes, but other than the Algonquins, the second largest group are the Iroquois. These peoples were in upstate New York and lived in a confederation of 5 tribes. They created a complex political system with a 2-house legislature with representatives known as sachems. Their social organization was matriarchal, with the clan mother making important decisions such as appointing the sachems. Tribes were organized into clans, which were further organized into families. These families shared longhouses, houses that were extremely long and made of wood, a very abundant resource. These societies gathered food through a mixture of agriculture and hunting and gathering. When they did grow crops, they grew maize, but more on that later. The northeastern tribes were the first to come in contact with the Europeans, which was a mixed bag to say the least. Okay, now we're going to move to the southeast. Here we find the remnants of the Mississippi River Valley civilization, or as it'd later be known, the 5 civilized tribes. These groups being the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole. These peoples cultivated the 3 sisters, the corn, the squash, and the bean. The Mississippi River system provides very fertile soil, the best in the world in fact. And using this, tribes along the Mississippi were able to expand both north and south. Their cities were primarily made out of dirt, which is why they are known as the mound builders. Also, why it is difficult to find ruins of these cities, because erosion made them, well, just a bigger pile of dirt. Trade along the Mississippi River was very important, as demonstrated in their largest city, Cahokia. This city is situated at the confluence of 2 parts of the Mississippi River system, which extends far to the east and to the west to the Great Plains. And, in the Great Plains, due to the aridity of the climate, there wasn't much reason to settle down. In fact, it has the same climate as the Eurasian steppe, so people naturally just kept moving around. These wandering bands of about 20 to 30 people were led by a chief, and subsisted primarily on hunting and gathering, but they also had some limited agriculture and trade with the cities of the east. In this area, much was the same as in the Great Plains, but they were cut off by the Rocky Mountains and other mountain ranges in the area. This cut them off from the Great Plains and caused them to form their own separate culture. Here, there was primarily hunting and gathering and much less agriculture. Trade primarily happened with peoples of the Rio Grande or the Pueblo. Speaking of these Pueblo peoples, we now come to the southwest. These peoples inhabited the upper Rio Grande and built brick settlements, which were dubbed Pueblo, literally meaning town or village. They were very resourceful people, who adapted to their not-so-generous environment with some great innovations. They developed extensive irrigation networks, and in some places they built dwellings out of cliff sides to be more weather-resistant. These people often farmed, and notably farmed maize. Now for a tangent about maize. Maize was the modern ancestor of corn. It was domesticated in Mexico and slowly moved further north with Nahuatl-speaking peoples until it reached the Rio Grande, at which point it spread into America and into the Southwest. Finally, moving leftly to the Pacific coast. Due to easy access to the coast, fishing was the primary way of getting food, and allowed for permanent settlements. Trade along the coast was frequent, due to easy access to the ocean and relative ease compared to the forested land. There were many tribes, but the most well-known were the Chumash. The Chumash occupied an area of Southern California, near modern-day LA, and produced some of the most complex basketry in the US, which was great for trading. Moving north along the coast, we come to the Pacific Northwest, also known as Cascadia. Most of the tribes here subsisted on hunting and gathering, as well as fishing, since the mountainous landscape makes farming less practical. A very well-known fact about these peoples is that they made the totem poles. Totem poles act as a form of visual storytelling, and believe it or not, being at the bottom of the totem pole means you're more significant, since you know, support everyone else. Just like the modern And moving swiftly and apolitically, further north, we reach the Cree and the Inuit. Generally, the Cree occupied inland Canada, while the Inuit occupied Alaska, the Canadian archipelago, and Greenland. These peoples hunted on the ice and used dog sleds to navigate the icy plains. Finally, jumping south all the way to Mesoamerica, we find the Mesoamerican civilizations. You'll probably know the Aztecs from student-led world history. They were the largest cohesive state in North America at the time of Columbus's arrival, rivaled only by the Incas in size, but they were all the way in South America. Something very important to note. While there are roughly 20 million people in Mesoamerica, there were only 1 to 5 million people in Northern America. That is the population of New York versus the population of Connecticut. Now that we understand how Native American societies looked before Columbus's arrival, it's time to look at the other side of the pond, and look at European societies. Prior to European arrival, Europe was divided into a bunch of agriculturally subsistent realms in a system called feudalism. But Europe was coming to its senses. After the Black Death labor scare, workers were starting to demand more for their work. So, in a whirlwind of change, European states started consolidating power into new monarchies, which are efficient since kings hold direct power instead of indirect power. These newly minted kingdoms started focusing a lot more on trade, and thus, they started looking for routes into the profitable Indian Ocean spice trade. So Spain commissions Christopher Columbus to travel across the Atlantic to find a tax-free route to the Indian Ocean with very little hope that he will come back alive. But he certainly found something. And when the word got back that the world was suddenly a whole lot bigger than they previously thought, a lot of people wanted to get in on that new cash money. So, people started sponsoring tons of voyages to America. But there was one big problem with investing in a voyage. If your ship that you put all your money into takes a dive, you lose all your money. So, we get joint stock companies. A joint stock company lets you diversify your investments. If you put an equal percentage into 10 voyages and one sinks, you still have 90% of your money. So armed with a safe way to finance voyages, exploration looks primed to take off. And this is only encouraged by Christianity. Since right around this time, ML with no K's Protestant Reformation was taking off, everyone wanted to go out and convert as many people to the denomination as possible. So, everyone's flooding into the Americas, and they couldn't help bring with them disease. But this isn't their only tool that will help them in the process of colonization. Let's talk about the tools that the Europeans, used to get to America. First, we've got the Astrolabe, an object from the Middle East used to determine a ship's position through astronomy. Second, the Sextant, a tool to help find the position of a boat. Finally, Dead Reckoning, a technique pioneered by Christopher Columbus that takes the speed at which a ship is going and combines it with the time it has traveled to find the distance it has traveled. Okay, so now things and diseases are flying between the continents in something called the Columbian Exchange. This term encompasses everything, tangible and intangible, that was exchanged between the Old World and the New World. To put in perspective how significant it is, let's examine cultural stereotypes. A lot of things we associate with different cultures are actually from the other half of the globe. For example, Native Americans of the plains did not have horses. The Italians didn't have tomatoes for their pizza. The Irish didn't have potatoes. Well, they wouldn't have them later, but that's a different story. And the Russians? Well, they still had their vodka, but you get my point. This exchange will later develop into the triangle trade and the transatlantic slave trade, which we will cover in just a moment. The first Europeans to conquer the New World were the Spanish and the Portuguese. Spain conquered basically everywhere south of Kansas, and Portugal mainly in Brazil. You might be wondering how Spain was able to conquer and control so much territory so far from, well, Spain. It definitely wasn't the Navy, despite traveling at a lightning-fast speed of 6 miles an hour. Well, it was the Conquistadors. Conquistadors were Spanish adventurers who traveled to the New World in hopes of finding wealth and fame. Also explorers like Juan de Oñate, who explored the southwest and established the mission system on the Texan frontier. Later, after the Spanish Navy had been taken care of, England and France got in on the colonization game. France aimed for Canada and the St. Lawrence River to get in on that fur trade, with explorers like Samuel de Champlain, while England landed in Virginia with explorers like Sir Francis Drake. But neither the French nor the English made as rapid territorial gains as the Spanish. Spain was able to establish itself so quickly through the Encomienda system, a system of land grants to Spanish immigrants, or peninsulares, and the right to the labor of those who lived on the land. This gave rise to the silver trade, which was the reason for Spain's wealth, eminence, and eventual decline. But the Encomienda system had the consequence of establishing a racial caste system in the colonies. This Casta system was extremely complex and had 16 categories. like Mestizo, a child of a Native American and a European, or Mulatto, a child of a European and an African. And since there are relatively few European immigrants versus the 20 million Americans, many mixed-race relationships formed, which filled each of these artificially created sections, or castas. But this poor treatment and social division led to some criticism of the Spanish crown, namely by Bartolomé de las Casas, a Portuguese clergyman who criticized the enslavement of Native Americans. His solution? Enslave the Africans. To be fair, he later decided that racialized slavery was bad, but the damage had already been done. Pair this with the fact that Native American population had been ravaged by disease, we get the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. Landowning Europeans across the Americas saw Africans as a source of labor. So, many merchants decided to travel to Africa and either purchase POWs from local monarchs or raid coastal towns which were often unprotected. These newly enslaved Africans endured the long and horrendous Middle Passage. They were treated more like sardines than humans. Then, once in the New World, they were treated like livestock and sold in mass. This came to be known as chattel slavery, coming from cattle, since they were literally treated as livestock. This influx of Africans to New World caused many unique cultural developments. An example of these are the Voodoo religions. These religions combine elements of Catholicism, Native American spirituality, and traditional African religions to form a whole new religion. A lot of these new cultural developments happened in Maroon Towns, which were settlements made up of runaway slaves and Native Americans which were far away from the influence of colonizing Europeans. Okay, this is a lot of information. Let's summarize it. Different European nations arrive in a diverse new world, each bringing with them different administrative structures, and develop different dynamics with the native peoples in their area. Goods, ideas, and diseases fly back and forth between the old and new world in the Columbian Exchange. And as native populations declined due to disease, African slaves were introduced to the New World, which manifested in new cultural and social developments. This sets the stage for more European arrival in North America and the interactions which will follow. There's a lot on the horizon, especially that one boat coming towards Jamestown. We shall see what comes of it. The good, the bad, and the horrible. For now, this has been Student-Led U.S. History. I'm Matthew Premsyler. Thank you for watching.